Welcome back to Close Mode, the enterprise sales show. I'm Dan Sanchez, and I am here with Brian Dietmeyer, who's usually the host of his show, and today he gets to be the guest. I get to be the one sitting here asking him the questions, and today we are talking about on-demand revenue enablement. Now, it's a loaded term, so Brian, can you unpack that for us? Like, what is this term, and how did we come to using this for describing even what CloseStrong does?
Yeah, I think for me, it helps to think about the history of this. I think there's a massive sort of cliche as it sounds, tectonic shift happening with the way we enable sales reps. And if you look specifically, I mean, American companies spend $26 billion a year on sales training, right? But if you look at the history of sales training, it used to be all about relationships, right? Human relationships. Go into the customer's office, look on his wall, compliment his family. I mean, that was, if you go back far enough in sales training. And then, in the 80s, the notion of process, selling as a process came out. And that what born out of that was methodology. Here are the methodology steps. And so all this training rolled out, which is really good, making that sort of shift to a business process where you're uncovering customer needs and that sort of thing. And those training events mostly ended with some kind of a blank form, a purple sheet that you fill out on your account. And that's what's been happening for the last 40 years. And it was a helpful shift. And this is a story or a question that I've asked probably 60 people in the last year, CROs, sales enablement leads, sales VPs. So does this sound familiar? You've got some kind of a sales challenge. And so the way we're going to fix that, there's multiple ways to fix it, but one of the levers we're going to pull is sales training. So we have to train our salespeople. It's been a while since we've done this. So we announce it at SKO, right? And say, this is it. We're going forward with contender selling, right? And we're going to roll it all out. And then we roll it out either virtually or in person, in groups of 20 for the next year. And my question to many of those folks is, then what? What happens? The most brutal assessment I've heard of that was a black hole. We don't know. And I sold methodology in my previous business. It was that I found it. And I had that frustration. We ran all over the world rolling out 2-day workshops, drinking water through a fire hose kind of thing. That's what we did to the participants for 2 days. And I was frustrated because I didn't know how much of that was actually used after we left. And I knew we helped people. I knew we were helping them do better deals, but I felt like it was suboptimal. So that's that, and then what happens? So you announce a thing at SKO, you roll it out, and then 18 months later, a new leader comes in, and now we're going after, the flavor of this year. It could be something that sounds like Medflick or something like that, right? So we rolled out contender selling 18 months ago. Now we're rolling out something else. And companies are spending $200, $300, $400, $500 on these things, not to mention the time out of market. I think the opportunity cost is even bigger. We're pulling people out for a couple of days. And many of those people have said to me, yeah, I go to those events, I dread them, and I go because I can go to the cocktail parties in the evening with my pals. So that's the kind of setup for where on-demand revenue enablement comes from. And I don't think all that training spend is bad. Most companies have a base methodology in place. It just hasn't been instituted. So our argument is you don't need more training. Most companies don't. You need pull-through of what you already invested on, and you need a close plan. Yeah. This is another thing we found out interviewing a lot of companies over the last year. People get to the closing stage and it's a wild, wild west because everybody thinks that's all soft skills, and that can't be process oriented as well. So that's really on-demand revenue enablement is about going from these just in case training events that are rolled out to anybody, regardless of when they need them, and not a lot of pull through to really just in time. And this is a big piece, Dan, in context. You and I have spoken to some leaders, and we were speaking to Allie at Checkpoint, the global sales enablement lead for Checkpoint. And she was the first one to really bring up this notion of in context. Like, training is lightly customized, but it's, I'm the methodology seller. I'm selling you my methodology, and it's up to you to put your stuff into the form. And she was saying, sales enablement, and we have to put that stuff in context. We believe it's time to leap over the skill acquisition phase of rolling out and enabling salespeople and jump directly to the application in context. let's work on deals. Let's go directly to deals, one-on-one, not event-based and not 20 people, but one-to-one over the next year. We're going to apply this deal to deal after deal in context. It's not how to sell value. It's how to sell your value against this specific competitor, in this industry vertical or even in this geo. So I don't know if that helps at a high level sort of make that shift from just in case events to this just in time, on demand, constant in context pull through, which by the way is enabled by technology. One of the reasons I think
Yep.
methodology lives the way it lives is we didn't have the enabling technology. We have that today.
Just a few months ago, we were talking about the major shift happening to sales enablement, right? So we're kind of like adding on top of that now. We talked about the death of sales enablement, the birth of revenue enablement, because
Yeah.
I believe you said, like, was it the Society of Revenue or Sales Enablement changed to Revenue Enablement for a
Yes.
really good and clear reason,
Yeah.
to be able to have a broader scope, right? If I remember that episode right.
Yep. Well, it's covering when you think about, if I'm trying to enable a sale, I'm done after the sale is enabled. If I'm trying to enable revenue, it's a longer term process, and that to
Yes.
me is the easiest way to think about that shift. It makes brilliant sense. Yeah, it does make the whole management of the thing a little more complex, a little more cross-functional, but I think the rewards are going to be super strong for that. So that's why we're also making this shift to revenue enablement, to let's stay with the thing over time as it progresses through all the way through to renewal.
Now, I'll drop a link to that episode in the show notes for this one. If you didn't listen to it, go back and listen to it, because I remember that specifically because I had a major aha myself on what revenue enablement actually is, right? Because we talked about it then. It's like you have all the stuff that you're currently doing. It's a treadmill of stuff, sales, right? It just never really stops. You're constantly doing stuff. You're constantly making calls. You're constantly taking notes. You're constantly trying to move sales down the line. There's new ones coming in. There's some exiting, and there's some, that you're losing. So the big aha I had was that revenue enablement becomes the implementation of the new strategy, right? Because you have to keep going on the old strategy. You just can't stop it and then reset. You always have to be able to change the tires on the bus as the bus moving. That's kind of a tired metaphor, but it's a useful metaphor. And that revenue enablement is the function, the route in which you can then change the strategy while it's still moving. So dedicating separate resources, separate talent, more time to that, so that you can continue operating while still implementing a new strategy. Did I summarize that
See,
right?
yeah, well, you did, and I'm really glad you went there because I missed that in my answer too, because I think that is kind of the bottom line. It's executing your strategy one deal at a time. And there's only been one book. It was written by, I think, Frank Cespedes from Harvard, about how do you translate sort of that part of executive strategy that gets executed at the deal level. How are you translating that and making that come alive? And companies are not doing that, and certainly methodology training doesn't do that. So I think, again, I go back to this tectonic shift that, training on, general skills and acquiring those skills is one thing, but applying it to execute your strategy one deal at a time. And as your strategy is changing over the year, that's the notion of on-demand revenue enablement. And I believe it can kind of replace the training budget, that the future is going to be about that. And it's going to be less about, there's some great value to in-person events. A lot of people like getting the people together for the social ways. There are other ways to do that. Right. So the revenue enablement, on-demand revenue enablement is, executing that strategy. That strategy is going to shift. We just talked to a company a couple of weeks ago that had 57 products. And they had the strategy in place of selling this smaller sort of group of products. And that's what on-demand revenue enablement does. It says, okay, when you're trying to make the shift, like they were saying, it's very difficult to get to that place where we have 57 products and customer conversations. Like that's really hard for reps. So we're trying to come up with this grouping of solution. And so how do you enable the sales teams to do that? What do ideal opportunities look like when you're looking for this versus selling point products, right? And then how do you qualify against those ideal opportunities? And how does that change your competitive positioning? right? When you're now selling in this way and trying to execute this strategy, how does that, when you're up against typical people that maybe are product selling, how do you differentiate yourself? In discovery, it changes discovery. How do you go look for opportunities that are executing this strategy shift? And then how do you communicate the value to the customers? Here's the new value. Here's your business objectives, customer. Let me, put those together. I'm going to have words come out of my mouth to suggest how this strategy is enabling your business better. All of that requires dialogue at every phase of the sales process that's dialed in to executing that strategy, which, by the way, is going to change next quarter possibly. And that's fine. If it's on demand, consistent, recurring enablement with the reps over and over, one deal at a time, you get the chance to say, hey, we've had a switch, even down to the level of what does our commercial terms package look like when we're executing this new strategy and trying to execute this new solution. All of those pieces. That's the in context part. And Dan, the other thing I would add, and you've heard this, we've talked to a couple customers who are fixing this problem themselves. So the innovations are coming from sales enablement leads. And we spoke to Jeff at Snap, and he, if anyone wants to listen to that podcast, he's going directly to this. He's not calling it on-demand revenue enablement, but Jeff is leading these sessions that pop up all the time, where everything's directly in context. They're applying it to deals in small groups in this continuous manner, and they're foregoing the whole skill acquisitions piece of a huge methodology rollout and going direct to application. And there was at least one other customer we talked to where they're seeing this problem that I teed up early, and they're coming up with the solutions themselves. And so that's where a lot of our thinking is coming from, is watching the best in breed out there that are saying, hey, this is the way we handle it. And that's easy to do with a reasonably tight sales team. But when you've got 800 sellers, 2,000 sellers, that's very difficult to do kind of in-house. But that's where the innovations are coming from, is the actual practitioners.
The thing I love about giving it a label of on-demand revenue enablement it's so many syllables. It's 10 syllables for a name, which in a marketing sense, I'm like, too many syllables. But at the same time, you're like, but it's useful. It's incredibly useful to me to understand what's actually going on. Because if you think about it, revenue enablement in general, most of it is a continuous process. Very little of it is in the very beginning stage of planning. Like, this is our strategy. And we all know the hard part is in the implementation of the strategy anyway.
Yeah.
Right. Just like with Tesla, Elon Musk has gone out and said, like, designing the Cybertruck was not the hard part. The freaking hard part was building the manufacturing plant to do it consistently and steadily at the cost we needed it to, in order to hit the price point, in order to make the margin we needed to make on these freaking trucks. Right. And that's always the hard part, is not coming up with the initial design. Like, here's the plan. It is, and that's hard too, but in comparison to actually implementing it, that's the hard part. And it's continuous. Like, it needs to continue happening. You need to continue to make sure that the plan, the strategy, the method that you're using is continually being met and being adhered to, being trained on. You have new people onboarding. They need to be introduced to the manufacturing plant, to the process. And that's what revenue enablement focuses on. But like you just said, training hasn't caught up to that, right? We are not doing continuous training. We're like just dumping training at inner points, which is more akin to like just doing it one time. But most of the actual implementation is not done at once. It's done in small little bits and pieces throughout, which is why that on-demand part is important in my mind, because it needs to be done a little bit at a time, with the right piece of the training to the right person at the right time. And that's how we learn. It models how we actually learn. Like we talked about in like the Sales Training is Dead episode just a few weeks ago.
Yep. And that's as usual. Like, sorry, I was scribbling furiously while you were talking, because you made me think of multiple things. One of the problems that we have with methodology, if we don't just blame it on the methodology, is that managers don't have time to put it in context and pull it through. They just don't. So the question is, can we redefine training? I think on-demand revenue enablement, one could argue that is training, but it's training for 2024. It's the new way to think about it. It's not the 40 years of methodology rollouts that have been going on forever, but this is the new way to train your salespeople. And so I would say that. And then a big problem we're solving for is the pull through and leveraging technology to do that thing that managers just don't have time to do. The other thing that came to mind, Dan, as you were going through your stuff, is years ago when I was in the methodology business, we researched 150 companies who said they actually had executed their methodology and implemented it, and it was adopted at a really high level. And in fact, the definition was it was deeply ingrained into the DNA of your organization. And so I won't bore you with the entire research project, but the number one driver we're trying to get under. Okay, I think we reached out to 1,500 companies, found 150 said they're pretty good at it, dug deep in focus groups and surveys. And the number one driver that made stuff stick was that training was seen as an enabler of strategy. So there was a gentleman, Mike McCarver with KLA Tencor, who told me this story in one of the focus groups that, their company was a national company who started growing globally. They're in the semiconductor business, and their buyers were buying from them globally, but they were selling locally, and they needed a global plan to combat the global buyers, right? They were getting picked apart by a much more powerful plan. And so they rolled this thing out, and it was seen as we need to start selling globally because our customers are buying globally. And that was the strategy of all the way up to the CEO level, and it got traction. And so that's why I want to go back to your comment about executing strategy. This is where we get the executive alignment. Wait, you're telling me that over the next year, I can go, I think 5% of pipeline is coached today and reinforced and stuff put in context. We go to 80% of our pipe, and 80% of our pipe is being coached against the strategy that we're trying to execute. That's training for me in 2024, whether it's us or somebody else. That's the standard. The last thing I'll say about that drives me nuts is people say, oh, the thing about training, if you go there and you learn a couple things, it's worth it. It's bullcrap. It's absolutely that old adage. You take the opportunity cost of having 200 sellers out of market for 2 days, that's 400 days of selling that are lost. And if you walk away with one or two things, it's worth that, not to mention the hard cost of actually producing the training. It's absolutely not worth it. And that's what we need to challenge is, and you hit the nail on the head. It's, can we execute our ever shifting product strategy, pricing strategy, whatever it is? What does an ideal customer look like in this new environment? We've got to be able to execute that real time. Rita Hunter McGrath, one of my favorite but depressing books is The End of Competitive Advantage by Rita McGrath, who I think is a Columbia professor, I believe. And what she said is in the old days, and this is another reason why on-demand revenue enablement has to exist. In the old days, we started the year with our sort of structural competitive advantage. And then we put together a plan for the year to leverage the living bejeebers out of that structural competitive advantage. And she's like, that doesn't exist anymore. Stuff is copied so quickly, right? And we're copying other people that now what she said is we have to learn. This was the breakthrough. I'll save you reading the whole book, although she might be offended. Go ahead and read the book if the subject excites you. But she said we now have to learn to compete on a series of short-term transient advantages. So how do we monetize a shift real time that just happened? I spoke with someone at a shipping company, kind of a overnight shipping company, and they acquired one of their big competitors in another part of the world. And I asked him, how long before words are coming out of your reps' mouths they can effectively now position this new value prop you have in that you've just acquired this massive thing and grown your global footprint? He said probably 9 to 12 months by the time, if before words come out of people's mouths. Can't do that. You need to monetize that shift right now. And you can't do that when we think about training. Again, it's got to be in context. It's got to be on demand. It's got to be reflecting the real-time changes in your strategy. And so it is nothing less than a complete redefinition of what we thought sales training was over the last 40 years.
To be competitive in the future really comes down to the speed of your strategy implementation.
Yes.
The accuracy of that strategy implementation.
Yep.
The ones who adopt strong processes and highly likely to be tech-enabled processes in order to implement it across the company, especially if it's a mid-sized, the larger company. It's hard to move. Like they say, it's hard to move the aircraft carrier, right?
Yeah.
Well, the aircraft carriers that move faster are the ones that are going to be able to play stronger.
Yeah.
So, man, that's the unlock for me now. It's not just having a arm to execute your strategy, but it's like you have to make a continuous play at it. This isn't going to stop. You have to essentially build processes, system, and have technology in place for you to be able to continuously test new strategies and optimize, and that process never ends.
Yep.
But that's the new competitive landscape we're in.
It's a new competitive landscape, and it's the new enablement of reps. You often, you personally often hear me, and maybe our listeners reference Jim Dickey, who I'm fortunate to have as an advisor to our new business. And Jim calls this either competing at the speed of change or selling at the speed of change, which I really love. That sums up kind of where you were going, that when we think about competing at the speed of change, or how do we monetize these short-term moments in time we have to go steal a bunch of deals, we have to completely rethink how quick before words come out of reps' mouths that are leveraging that thing you have in this moment, that software, that acquisition you just made, until someone else catches up, which is most likely next quarter, and unless it's some kind of a massive breakthrough.
So I'm going to finish with this question for the audience. How fast can your reps learn, unlearn, and relearn? If it's not fast enough, if it takes 6 months to do all that stuff, you might consider looking into on-demand revenue enablement.